Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and hello to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany. We are entering the 9th week of the conflict in Ukraine, and in the past few days, it has been reported that Russia is making slow and measured advances on the ground in eastern Ukraine. But Russian forces are confronting entrenched Ukrainian troops, and intense fighting is likely to continue throughout the region. Russia's slower pattern of movement is a significant departure from Moscow's initial invasion in February, which depended on swift advances of tanks deep into Ukraine. That strategy failed and came at great cost to Russia's ground forces. We're joined today by two experts to talk about Russia's renewed offensive in Ukraine and the Western response. I am very pleased to welcome Lieutenant General Ben Hodges and Dr. Claudia Major. Ben Hodges is the former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe and currently holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He joins us today from Helsinki. Ben, welcome.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and the privilege.
I am delighted to see you again and delighted to see Claudia as well. Claudia Major is the head of the International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin. Claudia, herzlich willkommen. So before we dive into a discussion about where things stand right now, Ben, I'd like to get your assessment on something. Ukrainian forces defeated the initial Russian campaign in this war, and that has created the conditions for a stalemate in much of the country. Why have Russian forces done so poorly? And even though they are outmanned and outgunned, why have the Ukrainian forces been able to do relatively well?
So let's talk Ukraine first. The most obvious thing is that they're defending their home. I mean, literally, we've watched news reports, all of us have, where you see soldiers that kind of point behind them and say, "This is my hometown here, and my family is back here." So they literally are defending their homes. And there's as we know from history, there's a power and a determination that comes from that. I mean, they're risking everything for everything. And then there's a practical side. They know the area. I mean, they know the area, whereas an invading force, particularly, which is mostly conscript, has no idea where they are. So that's one part of it. I would say that actually the reality of the land forces is they're about the same. So the Ukrainians are not outmanned or outgunned in terms of fighting forces. The Russian forces, what we're seeing is the manifestation of decades of absolute corruption inside the Ministry of Defense, inside the Russian government, inside Russian defense industry. You know, they advertised the number was 900,000 troops. I doubt they have 400,000 troops of Army, Navy, Air Force, everybody. I doubt it. Now, you hear about thousands of tanks. I would imagine that 90% of those tanks couldn't run if they tried. They couldn't operate. The Bundeswehr spends huge amounts of money just to take care of equipment that is in storage. You can be sure that's not been happening with all of this Russian equipment. So there's a corruption that has really undermined any aspirations that the general staff might have had. There also is a lack of what we call readiness. I mean, we spend a huge amount of time and money for training exercises, for maintenance, for doing all education, all the things ready so that whatever is required for the mission is prepared. It's very expensive, so that's what we do. And there's a culture of you have to be ready to fight tonight. What we can see from the Russian forces is that they do not and have not trained to that level, to what we would call the point of failure, where you make mistakes so that you can learn. They also, I've been kicking myself, like, how did I miss this? Because I was one of the guilty ones who overestimated their ability. How did I miss it? And I think part of this is because they don't really have operational experience And it was the same sort of 5% of the Russian military that was doing everything from Georgia to Syria to Africa to Crimea to Donbass. It was the Airborne Division, some Spetsnaz, and Wagner Group. So the vast majority of the Army, Navy, and Air Force had no real experience. And that's why they made these ridiculous mistakes about logistics, the field discipline. They're not able to operate jointly. And of course, they don't have the secret weapon that we have. Sergeants, non-commissioned officers are the guys, the men and women that make things happen at the point, on the ground, or on the ship, or on the flight line. They don't have that. And then you have to ask, why have so many Russian generals been killed? It's because the system of command and control that the Russians have always used is a very top-down, hierarchical, centralized command and control. So when there's a problem, when a captain or a major or a colonel cannot make a decision to do something, generals have to get involved. They become much more exposed. And most of them are killed because they're talking on their cell phone. I mean, if there is any iconic representation of their problems, they don't have their own command network that allows them to operate tactically securely. And so they're talking on cell phones on a Ukrainian cell network. That's anybody can intercept, find the location, and then pound that spot. That's why these guys are getting killed.
So, Claudia, listening to Ben talk just now, I mean, it sounds like sort of a lack of experience, a lack of preparation, and yet, all of us who've been watching this unfold have really thought that since the 2014 Minsk agreement, Putin has had time to prepare for this invasion, and yet it's really seems as if the Russian forces were woefully unprepared, and certainly in terms of how the first phase of the war has gone, things did not go the way that he expected them to. The Russians have now regrouped, and there's a new phase in the war. What's your assessment about how this new Russian offensive is unfolding on the ground?
I think it's sorry. I think it's interesting just to recall that we had initially 4 points of attack that Russia was kind of putting its effort on. It was Kiev, Kharkiv, the south, and the east. And what we see now is a kind of regrouping and the concentration of the east, and to a certain extent to the south. Russia somehow tries to tell us that this was the initial plan. If you look at the last week, it's obviously not what the initial plan was. And if you listen to the military commanders of the last year, if you listen to the Russian officials, there is still this overarching idea of controlling Ukraine, wanting to control Ukraine. So I read it mainly as a kind of tactical adaptation to say, now we focus on the Donbass, likely because Russia wants a success to sell on the 9th of May, when they remember the end of the Second World War, on the victory over fascism. So they need a kind of certain, they need results for the 9th of May. So you can see little things like there was the information that starting from the 1st of May in Kherson, the ruble will be the currency, something you can sell at home. There was the announcement that they want to make a victory parade in Mariupol on 9th of May. So there are lots of indications that they want to have something to present on the 9th of May. But I think if you look at the public statements you can see from Russia, the overall idea wanting to control Ukraine, change the political system, they talk about end de-Ukrainization, is still valid. So I think we shouldn't fool ourselves. I think the overall idea is still there. And you could also see the kind of announcement that apparently, according to Russia, the Russian minority in Moldova is in danger, which is usually used as a pretext to kind of push over to Moldova. So if you look at the map now, you can see the Russian controlled areas in the east, and then probably the bridge over to Crimea, and then over to Moldova. So to make it short, we have a kind of temporary concentration on the east, but Russia doesn't seem to give up on the overall idea to control Ukraine. So we should get we should prepare ourselves. So as soon as it's getting better for Russia, they will bounce back, and it's likely to kind of come back also in military force. So it's just a kind of temporary concentration to have a result for the 9th of May.
So, Claudia, I'm happy that you brought up this date, the 9th of May, because one of the questions that I had for both of you is how seriously we should take the 9th of May deadline as being a date when Putin or Russia would be able to declare at least some sort of a victory. And it sounds as if, from what you're saying, that you think that there will be some signs of success, not the level of success perhaps that Putin wanted when he set out on this adventure, but at least that there are some sort of positive reports that can be taken back to the Russian people. So how seriously do you think this date plays into the current strategy? I don't know who wants to go first on that.
I think we really have to take it seriously. Obviously, if you live in an authoritarian state like Russia, Putin can declare, he can define what victory is. But I'm from what I hear from the official statements, there is a need to present something. And that explains the concentration of an area where Russia has an advantage, where it's already in the Donbass with Donetsk and Luhansk, and where it's easier to advance and to concentrate its whole firepower on one area. So I think my fear is that we are likely to see some very ugly developments in the days and the run-up to the 9th of May. And the two things I mentioned already, the victory parade in Mariupol and introducing the ruble as a currency in Ukraine. I mean, just a reminder, we're talking about Ukrainian territory here. Are indications. This is something you can put on your list. We had again the nuclear coercion in the last days with another nuclear signaling from the Russian side. So I take it very seriously as an indication that they want a result to be presented on the 9th of May. What it would be, I think Ben might be, in military terms, be better placed to say something. But this is what I worry. There must be a result on the 9th of May. And the 9th of May, just one point, can also be a point of rally again the population around that war, because the narrative of fighting against fascists in Ukraine, as they did in 1945, is a very strong narrative that Russia has been playing. And if you now look at the Russian public statements, there's also this kind of changing narrative, fighting the fascists ends against NATO. So it can also be the preparation for the bigger conflict. But I think it's a really big crystallization point for success, for the narrative fighting against fascism, and getting ready for the kind of bigger conflict with the West, which you find already now in the narratives.
I would like to agree with everything that Claudia just said. I also believe that this is a critical day for them. So what does that mean for Ukrainian forces and for Russian forces? I think this means that the general staff, the Russian general staff, is being forced to do something before they're ready. The reconstitution of units that have been so severely mauled the way Russian formations were in the first 2 months, it takes a lot of time to repair, rebuild, reorganize. You're talking about moving large formations long distances to get them back somewhere else. And they were not prepared to do that. So, I mean, they had to start from zero to begin this reconstitution process. The one most tangible thing we've seen, of course, now they have a commander, General Vornikov, but they still have like 6 combined arms army headquarters under him. So while they put one guy in charge, they didn't clean up, so far as I can tell, the command structure under him. So I don't imagine that all of a sudden now they're going to become agile and joint warriors that are able to integrate air, land, and Navy forces into a fight. The Navy wants nothing to do with Ukraine right now. I mean, they, after losing the Moskva, they have backed away a significant distance. So that lowers the risk of a amphibious operation. I don't see them actually ever getting anywhere close to Odessa. This noise that's happening in Transnistria, I think that's noise. This is an attempt to distract, to draw off resources. They don't have the ability to do an amphibious operation there right now. Certainly, we will be able to see if they start rehearsals or preparations. But for the land forces, they're going to be forced to launch something before they actually are ready. And which again is a classic Russian, just feed people, cannon fodder. And it is, Claudia used exactly the right words. It's going to be really bad, nasty for Ukrainian civilians over these next couple of weeks because of this, I think, an artificially accelerated timeline. I will tell you
So in
this,
terms of,
I would not want to. I hope they do have a parade in Mariupol. I would not want to be within 10 kilometers of that parade. You can imagine, because Ukrainians will be joining in the celebration if there's a bunch of Russians clustered around in a big parade formation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of these ugly developments and how things might escalate, one of our viewers is curious as to why the Russians have not used their air power that much up to now to destroy towns or railroad stations. And as a corollary to that, one of the things that I've been concerned about, and I think many have been concerned about, is some of the signaling that we've heard from Russia, reminding us about the size and power of its nuclear arsenal. And this is sort of an unsubtle warning that if Russia's conventional forces face more humiliating losses, Putin has some other options. And so the longer the Ukrainians hold out, the more our concern grows that Russia might use chemical weapons as were used in Aleppo, or even targeted limited nuclear weapons. And so I guess my question to both of you is how concerned are you about the possible use of chemical or tactical nuclear weapons? And then this viewer question about why air power is not playing as much of a role.
Okay, first of all, air power. The Air Force is just as poorly trained as the Army is. I mean, the pilots are good enough to keep the airplane horizontal, but you notice that they are, almost all of them are launching their weapons from inside Russian airspace. They are very concerned about Ukrainian air defense. And so you don't see air power being displayed the way you would if it was a NATO air campaign, where you're in there, you're destroying logistics infrastructure, you're destroying command and control, you're destroying all the key things that the defender needed. So because they can't, they don't have the operational skill to do that. Our pilots, NATO pilots, spend a lot of time in the cockpit, in simulators, on exercise, practicing support for ground operations, air to air, all the aerial refueling, all these things. Russians don't do that. It's expensive. It takes time. They don't do it. So that's why, even though they've got a lot of expensive airplanes, they don't have a very good Air Force, which is good news for us, because if they're not out there supporting whatever kind of attacks are coming, it makes the defender's problem a little bit easier. That's why I think we haven't seen too much Russian air power, which is another reason why we should be. It was a mistake when Poland offered these MiGs. This was a mistake by the United States to interfere with that. I think the Poles were a little bit clumsy in this, and the idea of laundering them through Ramstein. We could have been much more clever about this whole thing, but give Ukrainians the opportunity to strike deeper. I think that's part of why we're not seeing the Russian Air Force.
Maybe I can come in on this. Sorry, maybe that's me coming from Germany. To come back to your question on the nuclear dimension, because this is a debate we had over the last days and weeks quite a lot in Germany, and what I find really important is to underline that obviously each conflict in which nuclear powers are involved are dangerous. And the nuclear signaling and the nuclear coercion that Russia is doing is highly irresponsible. In the same time, if we give into that pressure, this is exactly what Russia wants to achieve with this nuclear coercion. The idea is to put pressure on the Western governments, on the Western publics, to kind of divide them, to kind of create debates, doubts, so that our publics actually make pressure on our governments and say, oh, don't be too harsh. So I think it's really important to understand that mechanism of nuclear coercion. But to make it a bit more precise, because that might sound a little bit too easy, I think the first idea would to say that actually nuclear deterrence worked in that conflict in both directions. Russia didn't look for escalation with NATO countries. That's one sign that the kind of idea of stability and nuclear deterrence works for NATO. It also works in the other direction. This is one of the reasons we don't interfere as NATO in that war. So nuclear deterrence works for both sides. And so far, Russia has been very respectful of that equation. The second is that so far the nuclear signaling took place strictly on the political level. If you look in the more military dimension, have the arms been moved around? Have the kind of security state changed? There was nothing. So far it's really on the political level, which is a signaling of stay out of that conflict and trying to interfere in the debates. Third, and I think that's an important one, what would be the benefit of Russia of using nuclear weapons compared to the cost it would get? The US made it very clear that that would change the nature of the conflict and it would change the US role. Also, if you look to the allies or to those countries who somehow still support Russia, India or China, Russia would get deep criticism for changing the nuclear order established over the last 70 years in normative terms, in strategic terms. So the cost Russia would get if it would break the nuclear taboo of the last decades would be extremely, extremely high. There's no precedent even for a limited nuclear war with tactical nukes, nothing. So I think the strategic outweighed in a rational decision-making highly the benefit. So I think this kind of breaking this civilization thingy is really an important argument. And coming from a German debate where we kind of say, where one line of the political defense was we can't deliver heavy weapons because otherwise the tactical nuke would arrive. I would just remind that all allies kind of coordinate and agree, and it's a joint decision to support Ukraine. Last point, very briefly, what's the result if you don't support Ukraine? What is the result for European security and defense if Russia wins an aggression war in Europe? This is a scenario we should think about. If Russia wins a war, it would stand at the border to Poland. And we would have a Russia who could take the conclusion and say, we did a war in Georgia, it worked. We did a war in Ukraine 2014 and in Syria, it worked. In 2022, it took a bit longer. That eventually the conclusion would be we can wage war to get our interest. And in the end, Europe didn't resist. And we don't want to live, I tend to think, we don't want to live in a Europe where it's worse to wage a war to implement your interests. So I think we should also think about what it would mean in terms of security order, in terms of defense, in terms of escalation in Europe, if Russia were to win that war. So that should be something we should think about when we think about supporting Ukraine and enabling Ukraine to defend its territory. Ukraine is not waging a war against Russia. It's defending its own territory.
Although, having said that, it just popped up a piece from the Neue Zürcher Zeitung saying that Ukraine has talked about attacks on Russia. And in recent days, we've seen reports about gas depots and even a missile factory in Russia that mysteriously caught fire or came under attack. And so it does seem as if Ukraine is going on the offensive, not just defending itself. But I think you're absolutely right. It comes down to supporting Ukraine and not letting Russia win this war for multiple reasons.
Maybe just 2 sentences. I really try to be very brief. I mean, if Ukraine will lose that war, Ukraine as a free and sovereign country will not longer exist.
Yeah.
If Russia doesn't win the war, it still exists as a country. So we are talking about 2 very different things here. Ukraine is fighting for its survival as a country. It's defending against an aggressor on its own territory. Just to make that difference crystal clear.
Yeah. No, that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. So in terms of sort of how this continues to unfold, um, for weeks, it seems, since the beginning of the conflict, President Biden and Western allies have emphasized the need to keep the war in Ukraine. The debate over a no-fly zone, more recently, Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressing concerns that the conflict in Ukraine could expand to World War III. And now we've seen, this week, other developments like the Russian decision to cut off gas shipments to Poland and Bulgaria. There's growing concern in Washington and across Europe that the conflict may soon escalate into a wider war spreading to neighboring states. You already talked about Moldova, but also into cyberspace. How concerned are both of you about the possible expansion of this conflict? Maybe Ben, why don't you go first, and then Claudia?
Well, of course, you have to be smart about this and be concerned. But I think the alliance has done a good job of making sure that we've increased our capability across NATO's eastern flank. So Germany strengthened its battle group in Lithuania, for example. I mean, there's so many things that have happened. So to continue to deter Russia from making a terrible mistake that they think somehow they might be able to attack into the Baltic region, for example. So that an expansion in that direction, I would say, is extremely unlikely. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think they have the capacity to really do anything in the area of Moldova or Transnistria. They took troops from South Ossetia to bring them to the fight. So they're obviously not going to expand anywhere in Georgia. They even took troops out of Kaliningrad because they have such a serious manpower problem. And the general staff made the decision not to mobilize the reserves. That tells me there is no phase 3 this year. They have, when they put out the call for Syrian volunteers, that was the first red flag, and that was like at the 2-week mark. This is look, Russia is hollow. We were all caught by surprise when the Soviet Union collapsed. I certainly was. It was like, what happened? And I think that we are, and our unpreparedness for that is part of led to some problems that we're dealing with today. There was so much joy and happiness at the reunification of Germany and people were free. And we just assumed that everybody would embrace democracy and capitalism in the way that we sort of understood it. But in Russia, they didn't have the institutions, the pillars necessary for having democratic society and capitalism the way we think about it. So I think we should be thinking now about where's Russia going to be in 5 years? I do not think that the future is very bright for a Putin-led Russia. Their economy is going to be in tatters for decades. Their strategic mistakes of cutting off Poland and Bulgaria from gas is only going to accelerate the departure of their customers from Russia as a source and from carbon-based fuels as a type of energy. Their population is very unhealthy. I mean, it's advertised as 150. I would bet it's probably 140 million. That is a tiny population for a country that size. And I think that the corruption inside the government, the poor performance of the military, that actually Russia itself is at kind of a tipping point. I was in, when I was in Istanbul 2 weeks ago, part of our Black Sea study, we went out on the Bosphorus to understand, to go to the north end of it and the south end of it. The first thing I saw, literally the first thing I saw when we got in our little tour boat was former President Medvedev's yacht, which is about the same size as the Moskva, which is now at the bottom of the Black Sea.
Wow.
At some point, the Russian people are going to get tired of this.
Yeah. Claudia, I guess there's sort of two questions for you. One is this question about possible escalation and what your concerns are about that, but also given what you said earlier, that Ukraine must win this conflict, one of our viewers would like to know what the West needs to do to ensure that Ukraine wins and that Putin loses. And even if Russia holds some territory in Ukraine, it's hard to declare a victory. It really is then a stalemate.
I try to start with the second one. What the West needs to do, and the West for me are the Europeans, the US, and all those countries who buy into a certain common agreement. So also Australia or New Zealand. I think three things. It's a military support for Ukraine, and not only in this kind of step-by-step, every day we take a new decision, but what we need is a kind of long-term plan that is reliable on how we want to support militarily Ukraine. We know that we try to send mainly Soviet-style equipment because Ukrainian forces can use it quickly, but we also know that these stocks will end at some point. The material will just end on the battlefield at some point. So we will have the same debate in about 3 weeks again about heavy weapons. So we can now already think about the Western system and start training the Ukrainian forces on Western systems, as for example, the US is starting to do, France is doing with the César, and Germany and the Netherlands wants to do with the so-called Panzerhaubitze 2000. So the first step will be supporting Ukraine with old Soviet style, the T-72 tanks, then train them in parallel with Western stuff, and then introduce Western system into the Ukrainian armed forces. So the first is the military support. Second is the financial and humanitarian support for Ukraine as a state, the refugees and the population. And the third are the economic sanctions against Russia. And those are the three things where the Western state should concentrate: military, financial, humanitarian, and the economic sanctions. If you look at how this is going to end, if I kind of paraphrase your question, I think we should be very clear that we have two levels of the conflict. We have the military conflict, the war, which you can end if both sides agree to end. And here it's important that the end of the war defines the future of the peace, because where the border will be decide on the future borders of Ukraine. So the military conflict, you can end it if both sides agree to end it. But behind the military conflict, you have the political conflict about what is the future of Ukraine as a sovereign country. Ukraine wants to remain a free sovereign country, and Russia wants to actually it doesn't want a free Ukraine. So how do you get this contradictory perceptions of Ukraine's future together? And that will mainly be about how sovereign can Ukraine be? That's a question also about neutrality. What borders will it have? And who is going to be the guarantor? Who is going to offering security, reliable, credible security guarantees for Ukraine in the future? And this political question you can't solve it in some days or weeks. That will take really, 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 really long. For the question of escalation, I can keep it short because Ben made the main points. I think it's an extremely dangerous situation. But on the other hand, and I can't exclude any attack on NATO territory, but so far, I think it's highly unlikely that Russia will attack NATO territory. If you look at the last weeks, Russia made a very clear difference between NATO and not NATO. And what I said earlier, I think the nuclear deterrence equation works. I'm far more concerned for countries who are not under NATO protection, like Moldova or Georgia or Bosnia. I totally agree with Ben. Russian troops are overstretched. There's no indication in the positioning. The regeneration will take very long time, so that there's no indication for the moment. But we also have to, so I totally agree on that. I think it's unlikely. But last point, at least in Germany, we still very often think about two terms, war and peace. And what we have seen in the past is that you can perfectly undermine, and cynically speaking, undermine and destabilize a country below the threshold of a war. What Russia did in Ukraine since 2014 was destabilizing the country with cyber attacks, with economic pressure, with incidents at the line of contact, without going into fully fledged war. So to destabilize Moldova, like what we've seen over the last days,
Claudia, I think we just lost you. And
We also
so
see it in Mali. We might see it in the Balkans.
Yeah.
So I think it's not only war, it's the contestation and the conflict about which we should work.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of this destabilization below war, and really what we've been seeing in the last few years of frozen conflicts, and of Putin sort of taking bites out of other countries to make sure that those countries are destabilized and unable to progress. Ben, Claudia was talking about sort of who guarantees the peace for Ukraine after the conflict, and you're in Helsinki. I, for one, would be very curious to know what the mood is like in Finland, and get your assessment of how quickly you think Finland and Sweden are likely to join NATO under these circumstances. One of our viewers related to that wants to know how seriously we need to take Putin's threat that if Sweden and Finland become part of NATO, he will move nuclear weapons closer to these countries, particularly since the Russians already have nuclear weapons pretty close to Finland and Sweden.
Well, the idea of moving a nuclear weapon closer to Finland is, of course, a ridiculous notion because they can shoot thousands of kilometers. So it's not like you're moving a cannon up or something like
Right.
that. And you probably saw last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, after this announcement came out from Finland and Sweden, that both of them were seriously considering it, And so the Russians did, in fact, roll some nuclear weapons, made a big show of we're going to have to deal with this. And so on the Finnish side, they had a convoy of 10 tractors of farmers that drove towards the Russian border. That was the response, from the Finns. They're not intimidated at all. I am here in Finland right now in Helsinki, but just for everybody that's listening, I'm here in my capacity as a NATO senior mentor, along with a course that's normally operated at the NATO school in Oberammergau to help train people officers how to conduct NATO style operational planning. This was planned 2 years ago, but it kept getting pushed to the right because of COVID. So the fact that I'm here in Helsinki now is only a wonderful coincidence, but it is interesting to see how when I talk to Finnish officers or Finnish civilians, it's like it's a done deal in their mind. This is not 51-49. It's very, very strong, and you can be sure that the alliance will immediately get better, immediately, because these are two countries that they're both very strong democracies. They both have very strong, resilient societies, and they both have very capable militaries. The Finns, of course, have a small professional army, but in just a matter of days, they can have 200,000 troops in the field under arms. That's incredible. But they've developed their system over the decades because of their geography. And I think the entire alliance becomes stronger, better because of it. President Putin can threaten all he wants. They've been doing this for years. I mean, remember they threatened Denmark. If Denmark joined NATO's ballistic missile defense system, they threaten everybody all the time. I'm not dismissive of that, but I don't think they have the actual willingness to go through with it. But let's just say they decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere. Exactly what Claudia said. There's no battlefield advantage. It does nothing to help them. You can't destroy Mariupol any more than they've already done. So, and they've already got 10 million Ukrainians on the road. So you can't increase the terror level anymore. And it would be impossible, I think, for most of the West to stay out if they did, in fact, use a nuclear weapon or a chemical weapon. But our response does not have to be a nuclear weapon. The US and UK cyber together could wipe out every financial institution in Russia, could wipe out, shut down anything that they have that is connected to, that is digital. I mean, we have overwhelming cyber power. They know this. Or we may choose to use military capability inside Ukraine and wipe out all the Russian land forces that are there. just so I'm pretty sure we are communicating this to the Kremlin. Do not make a terrible mistake. We don't have to retaliate with a nuclear weapon. In fact, there are 2 or 3 other options that I think are even more effective.
So in terms of the Western response, Claudia, I'd like to hone in on Germany for just a moment. Obviously, you're in Berlin, and we've touched on Germany a little bit. We've all heard a lot of different positions from government officials and from Bundestag members in recent weeks, but it has seemed as though Olaf Scholz has really been waffling on providing Kiev what is needed to help defend Ukraine. Earlier this week, it was announced that Germany would supply anti-aircraft tanks to Ukraine. This would be the first shipment of heavy weapons by Germany to Ukraine. Can you help us understand a little bit why it has taken so long for Germany to provide this kind of support?
I think you would better ask the German government why it took them so long. So I can't speak for them. I can just give you the official reasons that we had over the last weeks. And there were kind of 3 competing reasons that were officially given. The first was, if we were to give Western equipment to the Ukrainians, it would take them just too long to actually get trained and use it, which there's an element in it that it needs some time, but it's also a pretty paternalistic approach to say, we know better what you can do and what you can't do. The second element was that Germany can't deliver anything because otherwise we would not be able to fulfill our NATO contributions. So sorry, we can't, because otherwise our NATO allies would complain. And the third element that was formulated in the public was that would lead to escalation. So if Germany were to deliver heavy equipment, artillery, that would lead directly to an escalation with Russia, which is an interesting argument that Germany would make the difference, if I would put it in a rather cynical way. So there was the impression in the German, with our partners, that Germany was hesitating, that Germany wasn't, again, really clear what it was really doing. And I can say that from an outside perspective, it was a highly irritating perspective. You could see from the statements of the Green, Liberal, and Social Democrat government coalition parties that they were fundamentally different. There seems to be no agreement in the coalition on what to do, very different positions. There seems to be some infight, if you can trust the letter of the head of the SPD parliamentary group, who talked about deep divides. So the impression was that there was not really an agreement. The last 2 days ago, the German defense minister announced that they would finally deliver the Gepard, which is, I think Ben could help me with the right English translation, a flak tank or anti-air cannon tank. I don't know what the right.
Fliegerabwehrkanone gepanzert.
An
Yeah, and in English,
anti-aircraft.
how you say that?
Yeah, this is an armored air defense weapon.
Yeah. And that on the political level was a good decision because it showed Germany was finally doing something. Germany also agreed to train Ukrainian forces on the Panzerhaubitze 2000 artillery together with the Netherlands. And it was proposing to do to actually support Slovenia. Slovenia was sending old Soviet T-72 tanks, and Germany was filling the holes in Slovenia. So Germany was moving. In the same time, the impression with our partners that Germany was hesitating again was really not helpful. And if you really go into the details, one should also say it's the German industry that is offering its old stocks of the Gepards, and the government is authorizing the industry selling its old stocks to Ukraine. So it's actually an industrial offer, and the German government is not stopping it any longer. It could have happened already several weeks ago. So on the political, symbolical level, yes, a great decision. On the practical level, it could have come earlier. It's an industrial deal, and it's a really, really old and complicated system. So if you really want to make a difference, you really have to start the training now. You have to sort all the unanswered questions about maintenance, about spare parts, about ammunition, which haven't yet been answered. So it's a I see the big symbolical political dimension. I'm less impressed on the military dimension. And I tend to think that Germany could move a bit more and kind of start thinking about a sustainable plan on how to support Ukraine, what I mentioned earlier, first Soviet, then Western, and then long-term industrial capabilities, and kind of convince our partners that we are really willing to do more.
Yeah, please, Ben.
Okay, so I'd like to pile on to what Claudia has said, but from an outsider, an American perspective. I think put it in context. So of course, Germany, ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important country in Europe, what Germany does helps drive what others are doing. And this coalition government is under massive pressure from multiple directions to make a decision. And it looks to me like they have arrived at a much better place. We're still in 9 weeks from when this started. I mean, it was only 7 weeks ago, the US was arguing about whether or not we should provide Stinger. So, yes, Germany should have come to this much sooner, but all of us should have come to this much sooner. And I'm not making any excuses for the German government, but there are 0 American tanks in Ukraine. There are 0 British tanks in Ukraine. There are 0 French tanks in Ukraine. So I think that the so much focus on why doesn't Germany give up these armored vehicles is, I think, out of balance. Now, I trust the numbers I hear from the Bundeswehr about the mortars. There are 250 something mortars that the Bundeswehr owns. Rheinmetall has about 120 something. But this happens to all of us, every army. When you transition from one system to a new system, when you go through modernization, of course, industry stops making parts for the old system. Right. Just like if Mercedes changes or BMW changes something, they don't keep manufacturing parts, for the old model because they have a new supply chain. So these 120 something that Rheinmetall owns, that's where the parts are coming from to repair the mortars that the Bundeswehr uses. We call this cannibalization. And so there is no supply chain. So it's not like Germany or somebody's sitting on top of 300 mortars and we just don't want to give them up. They're literally not available. So that's from a practical, it's kind of tedious, but it's important. You can't, throw charges that Germany is not doing their part. You have to understand those numbers. Now, inside that, the government, this is where it does get political, because the Bundeswehr said we can't give up our operational mortars because of the 9 Panzergrenadier battalions of the German Bundeswehr, 4 of them are in mortars. 1 is in the Puma, and the other 4 are waiting for the new Puma. So the modernization effort is going very slow. So if Germany were to give up operational mortars, that would come out of one of those 4 battalions. That means that they would, in fact, fall short of meeting NATO obligations. This is legitimate. So now it's political. If they wanted to, the chancellor could go to NATO and say, look, we're obligated to do this, but we think it is so important to provide this very good, tested, relatively simple technology to the Ukrainians. We would like to give a battalion to them, but we won't be able to do this NATO mission. I'm willing to bet that NATO in a second would say, of course, somebody else will stand up. And so the inverse of the Ringtausch. So I think what I would like to see Germany do is start talking about winning. Okay, support this notion that Ukraine has to win. That this is just like in the German Grundgesetz, human dignity. That's article number 1. It's about human dignity. And that's also in the UN Charter, human dignity. Let Germany step up and say, you know what, we'll take on responsibility for air and missile defense for all of the Baltic region. All right, we'll take that on. And by the way, we're the best in the world, Germany, at logistics. We will manage the delivery or the accumulation of all this aid that's going in through Poland, Romania, and Slovakia. Let us run that. We'll organize that. So take on other responsibilities instead of arguing about whether or not we should, send these old vehicles.
Mhm.
Can I just
Claudia,
add 2 points, because I think Ben made a really important point. I didn't want to do Germany bashing. I think there was a big problem with communication, because Germany, to a certain extent over the last weeks, insisted very much on what it was not doing, rather than showing what it was already doing. And in terms of communication, that wasn't helpful, because if you look at what Germany has been sending over to Ukraine, that's considerable. But the communication about what Germany was doing and what it was not doing wasn't really, I should say, successful. The last point Ben did is, for me, really important. We just wrote a little paper exactly on that question. We have 2 objectives: Germany assuring its promises to NATO, and the other objective, we want Ukraine to prevail. They seem to be contradictory. If Germany says we can't deliver the martyrs because we have been promised to NATO, I think they're not contradictory, because it's in our interest, actually, that Ukraine prevails. So in cooperation with our NATO partners and with a refill plan, a credible, I think we should talk in NATO about whether it would be acceptable to temporarily, with a kind of security plan behind, we could accept tiny changes in the contributions, because the priority is the war that is happening in Ukraine, and not the planning for the worst case, which we're doing in NATO. I'm not talking about giving up on NATO, totally not. I know that the Allies trust Germany on that. But if Ukraine loses this war, the security situation for Germany, NATO, and whole of Europe would be even worse. So in agreement with the NATO partners, it would be a political decision to say, let's give some martyrs from this, what Ben nicely called cannibalization reserve, from there, and the kind of units, let's give them to Ukraine, because this is the priority. But that's a political decision you can only take together with your NATO partners and within security and refill plan. But this is something we could talk about. So again, I think Germany does a lot, but it didn't communicate well, and it could do better on those fronts.
But let me push you both on this as we sort of wrap up today. I mean, you've both talked about how time is really of the essence for Ukraine, and we can't afford to wait a few weeks. There is a hot conflict going on. It is escalating. The fighting will continue. So Ukraine needs support now. Several weeks ago, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock was talking about trying to come up with creative solutions to try to help Ukraine. And what the two of you have just proposed is along the lines of some of these creative solutions. To what degree do you see the German government actually entertaining this discussion or having this debate? How likely is it that Olaf Scholz would go to NATO and say, let's do a reverse Ringtausch along the lines that both of you have described?
Okay. Of course, Claudia would know better than me the likelihood of something like that. But I think today, didn't the Bundestag vote overwhelmingly to support this increased support for Ukraine, the delivery of weapons? So it seems to me that, of course, there will be opposition to it, but the majority of the Bundestag is in favor of this. So that would seem to be not such a massive political risk for the chancellor, the Bundeskanzler, to do this, to lead. At the end of the day, this is what I think why Germany is coming around to this, is they see themselves, Germans see themselves as champions of the European values and the gesamte europäische Friedensordnung. The credibility is eroding before their very eyes. And other Europeans are getting a little bit weary of Germans wagging their finger at, you need to do this. And so I think Germany is looking at this and realizes it's up to us. We have to do this. You can't talk about never again and then never do anything. You can't talk about European values and then stand by while Russia smashes all of those values right next door.
Mhm. Claudia, the last word goes to you.
I think that was already a very nice last word. So I maybe just add that so far in that war, Germany always managed to take the good decisions in the end. So I'm confident that this will also be the case over the next weeks.
I share your optimism and your hope, but I come back to my concern about time really being of the essence and not having the luxury to wait. It comes back to points that both of you have made about Ukraine needing to win this for the sake of the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. And Ukraine needs support from the West. And so how we can quickly provide that support becomes absolutely essential. Ben Hodges, Claudia Major, it is always a pleasure to talk with you, even when the circumstances are difficult and dire. This has been incredibly enlightening and engaging, and I hope that we can reconvene in the not too distant future, because this is a topic that is not going to disappear anytime soon. And I certainly feel that our members, our friends, our viewers always benefit from your thoughtful and thought-provoking insights. So I want to thank both of you for being with us today.
Thanks for having us. Always great to discuss with Ben and you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Well,
guys.
thank you. And of course, thanks to our viewers for great questions. I'm sorry that I could not accommodate all of them, but all the more reason for us to continue the conversation in a few weeks or in a few months. But my best regards to both of you, and I hope that we're able to actually see each other in person in the not too distant future as well.
Ebenso.